You see, before an avoidant even thinks about reconnecting with you, they must undergo a very specific psychological process. And this is critical to understand, not just for the sake of knowledge, but for your own emotional survival. Avoidants don't just decide to reconnect on a whim. What might seem like a spontaneous message or unexpected check-in is, in fact, the end result of an extended internal process, a private psychological rehearsal that begins long before you ever hear from them. This is because avoidantly attached individuals are not emotionally reckless. They are, in truth, emotionally cautious. Connection feels risky to them, and vulnerability threatens the very identity they've built around self-sufficiency and emotional control. So when an avoidant considers reaching out, they don't do it from a place of emotional clarity. They do it from a place of internal tension. Their mind starts revisiting old interactions. They recall the warmth they pushed away, the closeness they once feared, and the moments they now miss. But they replay these memories not with openness, but with guarded curiosity. They analyze, they rationalize, and they wonder, if I reach out, will I still be wanted? But they don't say that out loud. They play it safe, internally. They construct possible outcomes like chess moves, anticipating what your response might be. If they sense emotional danger, if they fear rejection or emotional pressure, they retreat back into silence. This mental rehearsal also allows them to maintain emotional control. They can fantasize about reconnection without the risks of it. It's a safe space for them. Thinking about you without the need to face the consequences of actually being vulnerable. They might reread old texts, check your social media, ask mutual friends about you, or reflect on the last time you spoke. All of this, though passive in appearance, is active within their internal world. They're gathering data to determine whether the environment is emotionally safe for them to step back into. What many people misunderstand is that avoidants don't need distance because they don't care. They need distance because closeness overwhelms them, and reapproaching intimacy feels like walking into a fire. That's why they need time. Time to think, time to regulate their fear, time to calculate whether reconnection will cost them their sense of autonomy or ego stability. And most critically, they need to believe they still have power, that they're not crawling back, that if they do reconnect, they're doing it from a position of control, not need. So even when they reach out, they'll often disguise it in neutrality, a casual just checking in, or a seemingly random meme. But behind that simple gesture is a long psychological narrative they've been building, revising and convincing themselves of for days or even weeks. Understanding this helps you shift your perspective. Their silence doesn't mean indifference, and their message doesn't mean change. It means they've finally rehearsed enough to test the waters, and whether you let them swim or sink. Now, that decision rests with you. Avoidantly attached individuals rarely approach emotional situations directly. Their fear of vulnerability makes them observers before they are participants. When an avoidant X begins to consider reconnection, they don't simply reach out and risk raw emotional exposure. Instead, they begin by carefully assessing your emotional availability, not through overt questions or heartfelt confessions, but through subtle cues and indirect signals. This psychological probing is their way of testing the water while maintaining the illusion of emotional distance and control. They might start with seemingly innocent contact, a vague message, a reaction to your story, or an accidental like on a photo. These actions aren't random. They are feelers, meant to gauge your receptivity without committing to vulnerability themselves. If you respond warmly, they'll register that as safety. If you ignore or respond coolly, they interpret it as emotional threat. Their emotional radar is finely tuned to detect rejection, shame, or loss of power. So every gesture from you becomes a data point in their internal analysis. But the avoidant doesn't stop there. They pay attention to patterns. They watch how quickly you reply, the tone of your responses, and whether you initiate conversations. Are you still emotionally invested, or have you moved on? These micro assessments help them determine whether it's safe to re-engage without losing face or compromising their independence. It's not that they don't care. It's that they care in a way that doesn't look like caring. They care through distance, through observation, through control. And if your energy feels detached, grounded, or even indifferent, that contrast becomes psychologically significant. Avoidants are drawn to emotional certainty, but they fear emotional demand. If you appear balanced and emotio ally self-sufficient, it creates a strange paradox for them. You are now safe because you are not chasing. You've become attractive not because you've begged for them, but because you've stopped. Your absence, your detachment, your lack of emotional urgency, these things signal that you are not a threat to their autonomy. And paradoxically, that makes you desirable again. This emotional scan can go on for weeks. They may not say a word, but they're watching, not just what you say, but how you exist. Have you grown without them? Are you thriving or suffering? Do you still orbit their world, or have you stepped into your own? All of this shapes how they perceive the emotional terms of potential reconnection. Ultimately, avoidants don't assess you through words. They assess you through energy, through silence, through the consistency of your behavior. They're constantly decoding your availability without ever having to ask for it directly, because asking would mean admitting need, and that is their greatest emotional risk. So they seek confirmation through observation, never confrontation, and only when they feel sufficiently safe, in control, and convinced that you won't emotionally overwhelm them, will they take the calculated risk to return. For an avoidant, ego is not just pride. It's a psychological fortress constructed over years of emotional self-preservation. Reaching out, especially after distance or conflict, represents a threat to this fragile structure. To reconnect, their ego must first feel protected, safe from shame, rejection, or emotional unpredictability. This internal need for self-preservation overrides longing, nostalgia, or even love. It's not that they don't miss you, it's that the fear of exposure, of losing the upper hand or appearing emotionally vulnerable, paralyzes them. The avoidant ego is deeply invested in control. It thrives on emotional independence, on the illusion that they don't need others to feel whole. So when a relationship ends, they may initially feel relief or empowerment, not because they don't care, but because detachment reinforces their self-preservation. But as time passes and emotional echoes begin to surface, regret, longing, or unresolved feelings, there's an internal tug-of-war. One part of them wants to reach out. The other, larger part, insists on staying silent to protect the self from perceived humiliation or neediness. This internal tension creates a strange paralysis. Avoidants may replay scenarios in their mind over and over, how they might message you, what they would say, how you might respond. But if there's even a hint that you might reject them, appear disinterested, or worse, call out their emotional inconsistency, the ego slams the door shut. To them, rejection isn't just about hurt, it's a dismantling of their entire emotional identity. They don't bounce back from vulnerability the way securely attached individuals do. For avoidance, shame becomes a shutdown. That's why they often wait for signals, anything that might reassure them that they're still wanted, still significant, still emotionally safe to return to. A warm Instagram post, a quote that hints at missing someone, a friend mentioning that you've been asking about them. These indirect cues act as protective padding around their ego. They allow them to believe that if they do reach out, it won't be a blind leap into rejection. They are obsessed with avoiding humiliation because at their core, many avoidants carry a deeply buried sense of unworthiness. Their ego masks that void. This also explains why avoidants may reach out in ways that don't seem emotionally sincere. They might send a meme, a song, a vague check-in. These low-risk messages serve as ego-preserving mechanisms. If you don't respond, they can easily retreat without emotional damage. It was just a casual message, they tell themselves. But if you do respond positively, it offers them the ego reassurance they desperately need to continue. So before an avoidant can reconnect, their ego must feel insulated. For the avoidantly attached individual, the fear of rejection doesn't merely linger in the background. It dominates their internal world. It becomes the unspoken rule that governs their actions, dictates their emotional responses, and ultimately prevents them from forming or maintaining deep intimacy. While they may crave closeness on a subconscious level, their lived experience is built around the avoidance of perceived emotional threats. And few things are more threatening than the prospect of being vulnerable and not being received. This fear isn't just a surface-level discomfort. It's often rooted in early emotional experiences where vulnerability led to pain, neglect, or abandonment. Somewhere along the way, the avoidant learned a dangerous lesson. Needing someone is dangerous. Wanting connection opens the door to reject. Ion. And rejection is not simply painful, it feels annihilating. To protect themselves, they develop coping strategies that prioritize distance, independence, and self-reliance, even if those strategies come at the cost of emotional fulfillment. So when the opportunity for intimacy arises, it triggers a paradox. On one hand, there's a desire for emotional closeness, for being seen, known, and loved. But on the other hand, that very closeness activates the fear that the other person will eventually leave, betray, or reject them. The avoidant mind unconsciously weighs these two outcomes and almost always concludes that the risk is not worth it. So they pull away, shut down, or sabotage the connection, often before it can deepen. This is why avoidants are often described as hot and cold or emotionally unpredictable. It's not because they don't feel. It's because they feel too much and fear the consequences of those emotions. Rejection to them doesn't simply mean you don't want me. It means I am not enough, I am unworthy, or even I am fundamentally flawed. And that emotional conclusion is too painful to bear. In the mind of an avoidant, maintaining emotional control becomes a survival mechanism. Closeness becomes dangerous because it comes with the possibility of losing that control. The idea of truly opening up and being vulnerable requires them to surrender their defenses. And that means putting themselves in a position where someone else could hurt them. That perceived vulnerability feels intolerable, so they'd rather keep their distance, even if it leads to loneliness or regret. And when it comes time to potentially reconnect or deepen a relationship, they will often rehearse scenarios in their minds, imagining all the ways they might be rejected. They assume they'll be judged, dismissed, or emotionally overwhelmed. This mental rehearsal reinforces their inaction, keeping them trapped in isolation. So despite their longing for intimacy, avoidants often remain emotionally alone, not because they lack the desire to connect, but because their fear of rejection is louder, heavier, and more immediate than the quiet, distant hope of being truly loved. Until they learn to face that fear, challenge those inner narratives, and risk emotional vulnerability, the desire for connection will always be sacrificed on the altar of self-protection. Avoidantly attached individuals do not change course because of logic, persuasion, or even direct emotional appeal. They change when the environment shifts in a way that destabilizes their psychological equilibrium. that holds their world together. Intimacy demands vulnerability, and vulnerability feels like danger. In their mind, keeping you at arm's length is a form of protection. They believe if they don't invest deeply, they won't get hurt. And if they don't chase, they won't face rejection. And this defense mechanism only holds when their internal narrative remains unchallenged. That's where emotional contrast becomes transformative. When you are emotionally available, perhaps giving, responsive, or even accommodating, they felt in control. They sensed your emotional presence. And though it may have drawn them in subtly, it also allowed them to retreat without consequences. There was no cost to their detachment. But when you pull away, genuinely and consistently, they feel the emotional climate shift. The warmth they took for granted becomes absence. The validation they expected becomes silence. Suddenly, the story they've been telling themselves, that they are better off detached, starts to fall apart. Emotional contrast, in this case, is the difference between what they once had access to and what is now unavailable. That shift generates discomfort, not because they miss you in a superficial sense, but because the control they once had is now gone. They no longer get to feel superior, unaffected, or dismissive without consequence. Your absence speaks louder than any words. It introduces scarcity, and scarcity rewires perception. Where they once devalued your presence as too available or emotionally overwhelming, your absence now redefines it as something rare, something meaningful, and that change is not triggered by confrontation, pleading, or emotional declarations. It's triggered by your silence, your growth, your emotional neutrality. The contrast between how you once showed up and how you now hold yourself accountable becomes a mirror. In it, they don't just see you, they see their own behavior in a stark, uncomfortable light. That's the irony. For the avoidant to question their past attachment, they need you to stop reaching. They need to feel what it's like to no longer be prioritized, because only in that emptiness does the possibility of connection gain weight. Only in the vacuum does your previous presence become valuable. And so, emotional contrast isn't manipulation, it's clarity. It reveals what consistency and availability obscured. It forces the avoidant to reckon with what they've lost, what they've dismissed, and what they may truly want, but only once it's no longer guaranteed. For an avoidantly attached individual, autonomy is not intimacy. Therefore, for reconnection to even be possible, it must not threaten their sense of autonomy. Avoidants associate emotional closeness with engulfment. In childhood or past relationships, closeness may have been tied to enmeshment, criticism, control, or emotional chaos. As a result, they learn to equate independence with safety and emotional distance with peace. When someone comes too close, particularly someone emotionally expressive or consistent, they feel their psychological boundaries being breached, even when no such violation is intended. Their response is to pull back, protect, and retreat. This is not because they are heartless or indifferent. It's because their nervous system has learned that connection comes at a cost they cannot afford. So when an avoidant begins to consider reconnecting, they do so cautiously and with an internal checklist that revolves around one core question: will I still be free? They are not evaluating the emotional value of reconnection in the same way an anxiously attached person might. They are not measuring affection, longing, or relational potential. They are scanning for threats to their autonomy. If the other person seems too eager, too emotional, or too invested, the avoidant feels the old fear return, that to re-enter the relationship is to sacrifice the self. This is why emotionally neutral detachment is often more powerful than emotional pleas. When the other person steps back, not in punishment, but in genuine self-attainment, it creates an opening. The avoidant sees that reconnection might not mean surrender. They begin to question whether the relationship can coexist with independence, but the moment they sense pressure, spoken or unspoken, they revert to protection. This is because any perception of emotional demand feels like an infringement on their internal sovereignty. True reconnection, then, must come with a felt sense of psychological space. The avoidant must feel they are choosing connection on their terms, not being pulled into